It is hard to imagine the cold that once ruled the northern seas. The kind of cold that stings your eyelids shut, that turns your breath into frost before it leaves your lips. And yet, for the Vikings, those wanderers of the frozen world, this was home. When you think of Viking ships, you probably picture sleek wooden hulls slicing through grey waves, dragon-headed prows glinting in the mist. What you probably don't picture is how unbearably cold it must have been aboard those ships. No cabins, no insulation, no fire, just open decks, wet timber, and wind that could cut through bone. And yet, they survived. More than that, they thrived. They crossed entire oceans. From Norway to Greenland, Iceland to North America, sometimes weeks at sea without ever lighting a single flame. Because on a Viking longship, fire meant death. You see, a spark on a wooden vessel coated in tar could turn the greatest fleet into floating pyres. The sea was merciless enough without tempting fate with flame. So, how did they do it? How did men of the North endure nights that froze the sea around them, when the only thing colder than the air was the salt spray in their beards? The answer is laid in wool, leather, and myth. The Vikings were masters of warmth without fire. Their survival began not with flame, but with fabric. They wore thick tunics woven from wool, nature's miracle fiber capable of trapping heat even when soaked through. Beneath that, soft linen, over it, cloaks of fur. Often lined with animal hide, every stitch mattered. They didn't just wear clothes, they engineered armor against the cold, and when the sea spray froze on their faces. They pulled cloaks over their heads and huddled close, sharing body heat in silence beneath her. Northern stars, their ships themselves were part of the secret. Longships were flexible, yes, but they were also designed for endurance. The planks overlapped what we call clinker build, creating tight seams that kept out most of the freezing water. Beneath the benches, sailors packed layers of straw, animal pelts, and sealskin mats. When night came, they lay side by side on that rough bedding, their cloaks pulled tight, like wolves in a den. And then there were the braziers, small metal bowls, sometimes filled with glowing coals or heated stones from earlier on-shore fires. These weren't open flames, never. Instead, they were smouldering pockets of warmth, enough to thaw fingers and warm food. But not enough to risk an inferno. The Vikings had learned that true heat came not from fire but from cunning. Their diet helped, too. They ate dense, fatty foods, salted pork, dried fish, hard bread, and butter thick as your thumb. Fat burned slowly, releasing warmth from within. Their mead and ale gave them courage. Though not the kind of warmth you might expect, alcohol chills more than it warms. But for the Vikings, it dulled the edge of the wind and made endurance feel like victory. At night, when the sea grew black and the cold worse than pain, they sang. Not loudly, not for show, but in low, rhythmic hums that matched the waves. Songs that told of home, of gods, of past raids and future glories. Their voices blended into the sound of the sea, steady as the heartbeat of the north. For them, warmth was not a luxury. It was a ritual. Every night survived was a small defiance of nature itself, and perhaps that's what made them so unstoppable, not their axes, or their ships, or even their gods, but their sheer ability to endure. To sleep on ice, to wake to frost, and to keep rowing toward the unknown. Some say they whispered prayers to Thor, asking him to keep the storms at bay. Others believe they carried amulets of Freya for protection. But maybe the truth is simpler. The Vikings knew that the world would never be kind. So they learned to be harder than the world. By dawn, the frost would melt from their beards, the sea would calm, and the horizon would glow faintly pink. And as the first rays of light broke across the frozen water, the oars would dip again, cutting through the silence, driving them forward not toward warmth, but toward glory. Because for a Viking, fire was never in the hearth, it was in the heart. If you ever find yourself on a northern sea in winter, you will quickly understand why the Vikings were both feared and admired. The ocean there isn't blue, it's steel. The waves don't roll, they strike. Every gust of wind feels like the hand of a god testing your resolve. And yet, these men-farmers turned sailors, poets turned killers learned to live in that world as if it were their birthright. They didn't just survive the cold, they belonged to it. Each Viking voyage was an act of brutal discipline. Every crew was a machine of endurance. Forged in the frozen fjords long before their ships ever touched open sea, the youngest, boys barely 15, were trained to row until their hands bled, to tie knots blindfolded, and to sleep standing when storms made the deck impossible. But above all, they were taught silence. The sea demanded it. When the wind shifted, no one shouted. Commands were just as sharp, precise, and nod from the helmsman. A flick of the wrist from the captain, the creak of the oars, and the rush of water became there. Only music, their leader the steersman, or steersman, stood at the stern. Near the great steering oar, he was both navigator and priest, reading the sky like scripture. The Vikings didn't have compasses, not in the way we think of them. They had the sunstone, a mysterious crystal that could find sunlight even through cloud or fog. By holding it up, they could see a faint glow that told them where the hidden sun was. At night, they followed the stars. The North Star Polaris was their oldest friend. It anchored them to the heavens when the earth below was nothing but waves. Meals at sea were rare and brief. Dried fish, hard bread, smoked meat, nothing that spoiled. Everything that endured. Sometimes they drank seawater mixed with ale, just enough to trick their bodies into hydration. They learned to eat quickly, without complaint, and to work immediately afterward. There was no room for comfort, and no tolerance for weakness. One Viking proverb said, "The sea gives as it takes," meaning every gift of the ocean came at a cost. A fish for your hunger, a wave for your pride. When storms hit, they tied themselves to the benches with leather straps, heads low, arms locked round the oars. The helmsman would lash himself to the steering post and ride the waves like a beast. They didn't fight the sea, they endured it, because the sea was older than any god, and even Odin bowed before it. It was this discipline, cold, relentless, almost inhuman, that kept them alive when lesser sailors froze, or drowned, or prayed. They rode into them 1, 2, 3, each man a living part of the ship. The sound of the oars slapping the sea became their heartbeat. When the wind rose, they hoisted the sail a single square of wool, often dyed red or striped in brown and white. If ice began to form on the ropes, they'd chew it away with their teeth. They didn't stop. They never stopped. At night, when they made landfall, they'd drag their ship onto shore and turn it upside down, creating a crude shelter beneath it. Fires were lit on land then, but always small, hidden from sight. Smoke could give away a raiding party faster than a shout. They slept in shifts, half-rested while the other half stood watch. Wolves howled, waves crashed, and sometimes the wind carried the sound of voices, ghosts, they said, of drowned sailors calling out from the deep. In those moments, they whispered prayers not to Christ, not yet, but to their old gods, to Njord, lord of the sea, to Aegir, the ocean's keeper, and to Ran, his wife, who dragged the drowned down into her net. Every Viking knew someone she had taken, and so each voyage became both an offering and a challenge. "We are yours," they seemed to say, but not yet. By morning, When the frost glittered on their shields and the tide rose once more, they pushed their ship back into the sea, and as the oars struck the water, the sun, if it deigned to appear, broke through the mist like a blade, for all their blood and fury. The Vikings understood something most of us have forgotten, that mastery of the world begins not with control but with surrender, to sail those icy seas. You didn't command nature, you listened to it, and in that cold silence, somewhere between life and legend, the Vikings found a strange kind of peace. Imagine waking in the middle of the night to the sound of water slapping against wood. Not calm waves, but that slow, heavy rhythm that means the sea is changing. You open your eyes, and above you, 1,000 pinpoints of frost shimmer on the underside of the sail. The air burns when you breathe. You are lying shoulder to shoulder with 20 men, all of you wrapped in fur stiff with salt. Your clothes smell of smoke and sea water. Your boots are frozen. But you don't complain. No one does. The silence is part of the discipline. This is life beneath the ice. A Viking longship wasn't just a vessel. It was a floating world. Everything the crew needed to survive. Food, weapons, tools, and even animals was packed tightly inside. There were no cabins, no private spaces, no comfort, just the open deck, the biting wind, and the creak of oak that never stopped. Each man had his own sea chest, a small wooden box that served as both seat and storage. Inside it, his spare tunic, a knife, some dried meat, and perhaps a carved figure of a god for luck. Some carried a lock of hair from home, a wife, a mother, or a child waiting on some far fjord. That little chest was the sum of their world. In daylight, life was work. Every man had a role: oarsman, sailmaster, cook, lookout, warrior. The helmsman watched the horizon, reading the clouds. The oarsman rowed in rhythm, following the drumbeat of the man at the prow. The steersman's call. The cook stirred whatever could be boiled in seawater, usually barley or dried fish. Thickened with animal fat, meals were taken in silence. Shared from the same pot, there was no table, no comfort. They used knives for everything, eating, carving, fighting. A Viking's knife was an extension of his hand, and when storms came, everything changed. The sail came down. Men tied ropes round their waists and lashed themselves to the benches. The waves slammed into the hull like hammers, each one threatening to split it open. The ship rose and fell, until the horizon disappeared in grey. To the Vikings, this wasn't chaos, it was communion. They believed the sea had moods. It could be generous, or it could be vengeful. If they survived, it was because the gods allowed it. Some captains carried charms against the storm, small figures carved from whalebone, wrapped in sealskin. Others poured ale into the sea before every voyage, whispering to the waves, "Drink with us, not of us." When calm returned, they worked again. They scraped the ice from the ropes, repaired cracks with pitch, and baled water until their arms ached. The youngest among them, thralls, the servants and slaves, did the hardest labor. They slept last, ate least, and spoke rarely. Yet even they became part of the ship's rhythm. At night, under the aurora's faint glow, the men would sometimes sing low, droning chants that rolled with the sea. They weren't songs of joy, they were prayers, reminders of home, or tales of men who never returned. The sound carried across the black water like a heartbeat, too soft for gods to hear, but loud enough to keep their courage alive. Because courage, to a Viking, wasn't about not fearing death. It was about rowing anyway. The temperature could drop below freezing. the oars coated in ice so thick they had to be hammered loose with knives. The wind cut through wool and leather as though it wasn't there. But even in that, they found a kind of pride. The Norse word for endurance, drengskappa, meant more than toughness. It meant honor, restraint, the ability to face pain with quiet dignity. Sometimes, when frost formed on their beards, they joke that Odin himself was testing their breath, to see who still lived. By dawn, when the mist lifted and the sea turned silver, they'd begin again, the same rhythm, the same silence, the same endless grey horizon. And somewhere in that repetition, in that grueling, frozen cycle, they became something beyond human. Not quite sailors, not quite warriors, but something in between. Men who lived and died between worlds, between land and water, faith and fate. Life and legend, the Longship was their home, their church, their coffin. And every time they launched into the waves, they knew that one day the sea would keep them for good. But until then, they rowed, always forward, always north. For a people who worship thunder, it's ironic that the Vikings fear the smallest flame. Fire was sacred, but aboard a longship it was also betrayal. You could not light it. You could not trust it, and yet you could not live without it. So they found a way, a compromise between danger and survival. They carried fire in its sleeping form. The Vikings called it Logondig log, the sleeping glow, a box of smouldering embers, wrapped in ash, sealed tight in a clay or iron vessel. It wasn't flame, it was memory. A fragment of warmth carried across oceans, guarded like treasure. Each morning, the ember keeper, usually a quiet, steady-handed sailor, would kneel beside the box, blow softly into the ash, and watch for that faint, living orange, if it stirred. The men murmured their thanks. If it didn't, well, there were no second chances. Without that ember, there would be no cooked food, no warmth on land, no light in the dark. A dead ember meant the ship would reach shore as beggars, not warriors. They treated it like a god. Some even carved runes into the lid to keep evil spirits from stealing its heat. Others claimed to hear it whisper when the wind changed, as though the fire itself wanted to go. This was the Viking paradox. To master the world's harshest environment, they had to carry its most dangerous element in their hands. When they finally reached land, the ember was awakened. They'd feed it dry moss, birch bark, or shavings of pine, coaxing it to life. The first flame was a ritual. They didn't just light a fire, they rebirthed it. Every Viking campfire, every hearth, every whole flame, it all came from that single glowing heart that had survived the sea, and in that act, something profound lived to them. Fire wasn't just warmth, it was identity. The Norse word eld didn't just mean fire, it meant life. It symbolized the spark of being, the breath of the gods that animated men. The home hearth, tended by women, was a living link to ancestry. At sea, that link was reduced to a handful of coals and faith. They knew that losing the ember wasn't just practical failure. It was spiritual exile. That's why the ember box was passed down through generations. Archaeologists have found ornate ones, engraved, decorated, lined with bronze, carried not by kings, but by ordinary sailors. You don't decorate what you don't revere, and perhaps, on some cold night, when the stars were cruel and the sea was black, a Viking would sit beside that faint, glowing box and think of home, of his wife tending the hearth, of children asleep in warmth, of the world beyond the horizon that still burned with life. Because even in the darkest cold, that ember whispered a promise. The world is still warm somewhere. It's easy to think of the Vikings as hard and feeling, men who thrived on brutality. But the truth is stranger and more human. They endured because they were deeply emotional, almost ritualistic, about survival. Every act was sacred: rowing, eating, warming, sleeping. The ember wasn't just fuel. It was faith, the kind you could hold in your hands, and though they could never light a fire. Aboard ship, the warmth found other ways to survive. It flickered in their songs. It smoldered in the bonds between shipmates. It glowed in their stubborn refusal to freeze. Each man carried his own fire, not in a box, but behind his ribs. It burned when he cursed the wind, when he rode through storms, when he refused to die quietly. That was the true heat of the Viking world, not the ember beneath the pot, but the ember behind the heart. By the time dawn bled across the horizon, the sea steaming faintly in the cold, they would rise again, bleary-eyed, bearded, half dead, and start the same ritual. Check the ember, feed the coals, keep the gods alive, because on those icy seas, surrounded by grey death and silence, every Viking knew one thing for certain: if the fire dies, so do we. If you ask what truly kept Vikings alive on the icy seas, it wasn't fur or fish oil, or even their ship's brilliant design. It was each other. The North Atlantic was merciless, a place where the wind could strip the skin from your hands and the salt could freeze before it hit your face. The only thing between life and oblivion was the man sitting beside you. And that man, more often than not, wasn't a friend before the voyage began. He might have been a farmer, a fisherman, a blacksmith, maybe even a rival from a neighboring village. But on that deck, under the endless grey sky, they became brothers, not by choice, but by need. There was no room for pride aboard a longship. Everyone worked. Everyone froze. Everyone ached. You shared your warmth, your rations, your furs, even your breath sometimes, when the frost made your lips go blue. It wasn't sentimentality. It was survival mathematics. The more warmth you shared, the longer everyone lived. The Vikings had a word for this bond: felag, meaning fellowship or partnership. It came from fey, meaning cattle or wealth. To the Norse mind, your fey wasn't just money. It was what you shared. Wealth wasn't what you had. It was what held you together. That's why the same word described a ship's crew, a business partner, and a blood brother. To stand beside someone in the cold meant you were bound, not by emotion, but by honor. Inside those ships, hierarchy melted. The Jarl might steer, but he froze the same as the lowest oarsman. Titles meant little when the sea howled. The ice didn't care for you, so they became equals, bound not by rank, but by rhythm, the oarstrokes, the chants, the shared pulse of survival. All of it wove a single living creature made of many bodies. You could almost hear it breathe when the rowing began, a slow, human heartbeat against the roar of nature. Thump dot thump dot thump. Every stroke was a defiance of the cold. Every chant was a reminder we are still alive, and in that rhythm, something ancient stirred. The Vikings didn't see survival as conquest. They saw it as harmony. To fight the world was foolish. To endure it, divine. When the storms came, they didn't scream at the gods. They sang low, slow, almost mournful songs about home, about lost brothers, about fires waiting far away. The ship became a church. The sea became a god, and each man a priest of endurance. Those nights, when the frost crept across their beards and the roar shimmered like ghost fire above them, they would gather close, Not round a flame, they couldn't risk it, but round each other. One man's arm over another's shoulders, one cloak shared by 3, one heartbeat shared by 20. It was messy, smelly. Human warmth, the kind that keeps you alive when no miracle will. The sagas rarely mention this. But they talk about glory, about battles, about kings and heroes. But real heroism happened here, in the quiet, in the cold, when men refused to let one another die. The Vikings believed that courage wasn't roaring into war. It was waking up after a freezing night and deciding to row again. And maybe, in some way, that's why they conquered half the known world. Not because they were cruel, not because they were fearless, but because they knew how to hold on, to warmth, to brotherhood, to one another. When dawn came and frost glimmered on their hair like tiny crowns, they would look round at their brothers still breathing and nod. No words needed, just that. Shared, sacred understanding. We lived through another night, and in a world where fire was a memory and warmth a privilege, that small, stubborn miracle was worth more than gold. For the Vikings, warmth wasn't just a comfort. It was a mystery, a kind of magic borrowed from the gods. To them, fire was never truly theirs. It was something stolen, gifted, or won through cunning. Like lightning captured in wood, like sunlight smuggled from the heavens. The Norse told stories about it, about how warmth came to mankind not through creation, but through theft. They said it was Loki, the trickster, who brought the first spark, cheating the fire giants of Muspelheim. And ever since, humans have guarded it like a secret, an ember of divine rebellion kept alive in every hearth. On the Longships, the ember had to live inside the men themselves. No torches, no braziers, no open flames to tempt the sea gods. Only breath, song, and stubborn will. And yet, every Viking carried fire in another sense. Not literal flame, but a spiritual one. The kind they called sire. Sire was magic, but not the wand-waving kind. It was a quiet power. The ability to weave fate, to nudge the world's threads without tearing them, and it was deeply tied to warmth, to life, to the soul's heat. A seer, or Velva, might tell a crew to chant during storms, not to pray, but to vibrate, to keep their inner fire alive through rhythm. Each breath, each hum, each heartbeat a flicker of divine energy refusing to go out. You see, to a Norse sailor, warmth was proof of life. If you could still feel your hands, if your blood still pulsed hot in your veins, then the gods hadn't forgotten you yet. And when the wind howled so loud it drowned the world, they would whisper to each other, "Hold the fire," meaning, don't lose hope. Don't lose that inner spark that says, "I am still here." They wore charms of amber, which they called Freya's tears, hardened sunlight caught in stone. To touch it in the dark was to remember warmth, to remember light, to remember the promise that spring would come again. That's how myth worked for them, not as escapism, but as hindrance. Every god, every rune, every story was a psychological survival tool, a mental shelter from the cold. When you believe that this hammer roars with lightning, that Odin's eye still watches from the sky, that warmth itself was a gift from trickster gods, you can row through anything. The sagas tell of warriors who could sleep standing up, or row for days without rest, guided by voices in the wind. Modern scholars call it superstition, but perhaps it was faith in motion, a way to translate belief into survival. Because when the sea turned black and the wind hissed like serpents, the Vikings didn't see chaos. They saw stories unfolding, each wave, a reminder of some ancient battle between gods and giants. Each gust, a whisper from Odin himself, testing their endurance, and so they endured. They didn't just resist the cold, they redefined it. To freeze was divine, to shiver was sacred, to survive was a prayer answered. You could almost imagine them there, 100 men in silence, faces pale as moonlight, frost crusting their beards, eyes closed as they breathe warmth into existence. One breath dot another, and another, a living fire without flame, a light without smoke, a god carried in flesh and bone. When they finally reached land, that same fire became a feast, a toast, a roaring celebration of life. The first spark in the hearth wasn't just about comfort, it was ritual. They were rekindling the divine flame that had kept them alive at sea. And so, as they raised their horns and sang to Odin, to Freya, to Loki, they weren't just drinking mead. They were saying, "We brought your fire home. Now, let's talk about something that doesn't get enough credit in Viking lore, their stomachs. Because if you're rowing across the North Atlantic with nothing but frozen air and whale breath for company, you're going to need calories, a lot of them. But here's the thing, eating like a Viking at sea wasn't some grand feast with roasted boar and mead flowing like a river. No, those paintings of golden banquets, that was home life. Out here, in the middle of the ice-bitten sea, dinner meant something closer to survival chemistry. They couldn't cook on board. Fire was too risky, so everything they ate had to be preserved, dried, smoked, or fermented to withstand the voyage. And let me tell you, Viking food preservation was both ingenious and horrifying. First, there was hardtack, a sort of prehistoric biscuit made of barley, rye, or oat flour. It was so hard you could probably use it as a weapon. Sailors softened it by soaking it in ale or seawater. Because why waste good mead, right? Then came the real treasures, dried fish, mostly cod or herring. Sometimes whale meat or seal, depending on where they were sitting. It didn't taste good, but it kept them alive. That was the only metric that mattered. And then there was smear, butter. Not your modern, creamy kind. This stuff was thick, salty, and dense enough to chew. They carried it in sealed wooden tubs, and on the worst days, men would eat it straight, spoonfuls of cold fat, just to keep their bodies burning through the freeze. Protein and fat. That was the Viking fuel mix. The carbs were an afterthought, mostly in the form of porridge or dried peas when they could manage it. Sometimes they'd rehydrate barley in seawater, just to trick their stomachs into thinking they were full. But let's not forget the Vikings. Favorite form of hydration, ale, because clean water wasn't exactly easy to store. So they brewed weak ale, not enough to get drunk unusually, but strong enough to kill bacteria. That's what they drank day in, day out, morning, noon, and night. So yes, most Viking sailors spent their entire voyages in a mild, perpetual buzz. Not hammered, just comfortably warm in spirit and slightly detached from the horror of being soaked in freezing water for weeks on end. And when morale ran low, which, let's be honest, was most of the time, the stronger mead came out. Mead was sacred. It wasn't just alcohol. It was liquid mythology. The Norse believed it was made from the blood of Kvasir, a god born of divine spit. Yes, divine spit, because apparently, even Viking mythology came with a sense of humor. They called it the mead of poetry, said to fill your mind with wisdom and your tongue with eloquence. But at sea, it mostly filled you with the temporary illusion that rowing through a snowstorm was a good idea. Still, It served its purpose. Mead was morale. It kept spirits high, turned fear into laughter, and bonded the crew, at least until someone got too poetic and fell overboard. There were other oddities, too. Fermented lamb's milk, dried seaweed, even kelp stew. Not because they wanted to eat like that, but because hunger doesn't negotiate, and yet, somehow, they thrived. They crossed oceans, colonized Iceland, reached Greenland, and even made it to North America, all powered by dried fish, butter, and beer. It's easy to romanticize them as fearless warriors, but in truth, they were expert logisticians. Every barrel, every cask, every salted strip of meat was part of a system, a floating ecosystem of survival. And here's the strange part. They didn't just eat for fuel. Every meal, even the worst one, was ritualized. They'd thank the gods, share evenly, and make sure no man went hungry. That discipline, that unity, that's what kept them human up there. Because a Viking voyage wasn't just about reaching new lands, it was about returning home. And to return home, you needed everyone alive. So when night fell, and the ship rocked like a cradle, the men would eat in silence. The crunch of hardtack, the slap of salted fish, the glug of ale, it was the sound of survival. And afterward, someone would hum, just a little tune, a reminder of warmth, of fireside laughter, of fields waiting somewhere beyond the horizon. The sea would swallow the sound, of course. But maybe that was the point. You feed the gods a song, and they feed you another day of life. By now, you've probably realized that Viking life at sea wasn't a romantic saga of endless conquest and roaring fires. It was endurance, pure, raw, human endurance. And that endurance wasn't just physical. It was spiritual, you see. The Vikings didn't view hardship as misfortune to them. It was proof that the gods were paying attention. The sea wasn't an enemy. It was a test, a trial by cold and chaos, and only those with iron in their veins were worthy of crossing it. That's the secret to why the Norse world expanded so far, so fast. They didn't conquer because they wanted more land. They conquered because to stop moving felt like death. The sagas even say it. Cattle die, kin die, but glory never dies. That's not poetry. That's psychology. Every oar-stroke, every frostbitten night, every miserable meal on deck, it all built a civilization obsessed with proving itself immortal. And make no mistake, that mindset shaped their world. When Viking ships landed on the shores of England, Ireland, or Francia, they weren't just raiding. They were exploring, mapping, building routes of wealth and myth. Each voyage was a gamble with the gods to win gold, glory, and songs that would outlast death. And yet, behind every act of conquest was something softer, something almost sacred. Their faith in fate. The Norse believed that destiny, or wood, was a thread spun at birth by the Norns, three goddesses who wove the lives of men and gods alike. No matter what you did, that thread would unravel exactly as it was meant to. If you froze to death on the North Sea, that was your fate. If you conquered kingdoms, that too was fate, and so. Paradoxically, the Vikings were fearless, not because they lacked fear, but because they believed fear was irrelevant. You couldn't outrun what the Norns had written. You could only face it head-on, preferably with an axe in one hand and a cup of mead in the other. It was that same fatalism that made them thrive where others perished, when storms hit. They didn't curse the gods. They shouted back at them when ice broke their ships. They built new ones, and when foreign kings tried to crush them, they became those kings' bodyguards, the Varangian Guard, the finest mercenaries in Byzantium. They had this uncanny ability to turn tragedy into opportunity. Every disaster was simply the beginning of a new saga. It's what allowed them to settle Iceland, a volcanic wasteland, and call it home. What led Eric the Red to find Greenland, and his son Leif to step foot in North America centuries before Columbus ever dreamed of it. But Endurance wasn't just about survival. It was about identity. A Viking who didn't endure wasn't a Viking at all. The sagas tell of men who froze to death smiling, because they'd rather die with pride than live with weakness. Women who ruled farms, ships, and households with the same ferocity as warriors on the battlefield. They didn't need comfort. They needed meaning, and their faith gave it to them. Every hardship was Odin's way of sharpening the soul. Every storm, a reminder that life would short. Brutal and beautiful, the Norse gods were not distant deities of peace and forgiveness. They were flawed, wild, and deeply human. Odin sacrificed his eye for wisdom. Thor broke giants with his hammer. Freya wept for love lost. They didn't promise salvation. They promised story. That was enough. And maybe that's what made the Viking world so enduring in our imagination today. They didn't write history in stone or scripture. They wrote it in action, in voyages, raids, settlements, and sagas sung beside flickering firelight. Their endurance outlasted their empire, even as they settled down, converted to Christianity, and faded into medieval Europe. That spirit, that fierce, stoic refusal to yield, never vanished, because endurance, for them, was not just survival, it was art, to stand against the cold, against fate, against the very gods themselves, and smile. That was the Viking way, and maybe that's why their stories still echo in our bones. Because somewhere deep inside, we all want to believe that when the storm comes, we too can hold the oar, tighten our grip, and row toward the unknown. When we picture the Viking Age, the image that usually comes to mind is predictable. Burly men, tangled beards, axes glinting in the northern sun. But that's only half the story. The other half, the quieter, often erased half, belonged to the women who settled, traded, ruled, and survived alongside them. Because while the sagas loved their heroes, they also whispered of women who defied every boundary their age tried to draw around them. Women who didn't just tend the hearth, they owned the land. Who didn't just follow the men, they guided them in Viking society. Women had a strength that astonished outsiders. Under Norse law, a woman could divorce her husband, reclaim her dowry, and even demand compensation if he mistreated her. She could own property, command slaves, and inherit wealth, powers that even noble women in Christian Europe couldn't always claim. While men went raiding, women kept the farms, ran the households, and managed trade. They were the economic spine of Viking life. In sagas, when warriors returned home, it was often their wives who decided how the spoils were spent, or whether another voyage was worth the risk, and sometimes they didn't wait for anyone's permission. Archaeologists have found graves of Viking women buried, with swords, shields, and the gear of warriors. For decades, scholars dismissed those finds as symbolic. Surely, they said, the weapons were just ceremonial. But in 2017, DNA testing confirmed what the sagas had hinted all along. One of the most richly equipped warrior graves ever found in Berga, Sweden, belonged to a woman. A commander, a strategist, a Viking in her own right. The sagas called such women skjoldma, shield maidens. Their stories blur the line between history and legend, but their existence was no myth. In a world where men sought glory through battle, women found their own form of power, sometimes through war, sometimes through wisdom, and often through sheer will. One saga tells of Lagertha, a warrior so fierce that even Ragnar Lothbrok, the hero of heroes, sought her hand in awe. Another of Freydis, the sister of Leif Erikson, who sailed all the way to Vinland, modern-day North America, and fought off attackers while heavily pregnant, wielding a sword in defiance and screaming until her enemies fled in terror. But not all there. Battles were fought with blades, in the quiet halls of Viking homesteads. Power could be just as sharp. The Seikona, a woman skilled in magic, wielded influence that reached beyond kings. She could see fate, bend it, whisper to the gods. Men feared her and sought her counsel in equal measure. Even Odin, the Allfather, was said to have learned sire from a woman, the goddess Freyja herself. To be a seeress was to walk the line between this world and the next, to carry wisdom that came with a price. They were revered and feared, often traveling from village to village draped in furs and bells, carrying staffs carved with runes. Their words could send ships to sea or stop armies in their tracks. So yes, Viking women were not background figures in the saga. They were the saga, and when we trace the Viking diaspora, Iceland, Greenland, Ireland, even Russia, we find their fingerprints everywhere, runestones dedicated by wives to fallen husbands, farms founded by widows, contracts signed by women whose names carried more weight than their brothers. When the Longships set sail, women were aboard too, not just as passengers, but as settlers, traders, mothers, and partners in the brutal adventure of colonization. Without them, there would be no Viking world to remember, and perhaps that's the quietest, most haunting truth of all, that behind every saga sung of war and blood and honor, there were women weaving the fabric of that world, holding together what the storms tried to tear apart. When the men sailed into the horizon, it was the women who waited, prayed, rebuilt, and remembered. They were the keepers of legacy, the ones who turned stories into history. And though centuries have passed, their strength still whispers through the cold northern wind. It's there in the ruins, the sagas, the stones, and the songs that survived, reminding us that power, in any age, does not always roar. Sometimes it endures quietly, endlessly, like the sea itself. Every age ends, not with a thunderclap, but with the quiet sigh of inevitability. The Viking Age was no exception. For nearly 3 centuries, they had ruled the waves, terror to some, traders to others, and legends to all. But by the 11th century, something began to change. The world the Vikings had shaped with oars and axes was slipping away, replaced by new powers, new gods, and new borders. It began, as all endings do, with small fractures, the easy raids of earlier centuries, the monasteries and undefended coasts, were no longer easy. Europe had learned. Kings had built fortresses. Armies waited where once there had been monks, and then came Christianity, not as a sword at first, but as a whisper, a promise of unity, peace, salvation. It was a dangerous promise, not because it was wrong, but because it worked. When kings converted, their people followed, and with each baptism, a little piece of the old Norse world was washed away. Harold Bluetooth of Denmark was one of them. First, he accepted Christianity not from faith alone, but from strategy. A unified religion meant a unified kingdom. And unity, even at the cost of the old gods, meant survival. Soon, Norway followed, and then Iceland. Priests replaced shamans, churches replaced stone circles, and the sagas themselves began to fade from worship into memory. Odin still hung from the tree, but now only in stories told by firelight. Trade changed too. The silver that once flowed from Arabic markets began to dry up. New routes shifted south, away from the cold seas the Vikings had once ruled. The longships that had once been symbols of freedom now sat rotting on the shores, their prows half buried in sand. And then there were the kings, ambitious, united. Hungry for control, the very spirit that had made the Vikings unstoppable. Independence, exploration, defiance, became their undoing. You can't build an empire on rebellion forever. Eventually, the rebels become rulers, and rulers build walls. By the time the 12th century dawned, the Viking world had become something new. Kingdoms, laws, taxes, the wildness was gone. The sagas spoke of glory. But the reality had become bureaucracy. Still, the echoes remained. Every fjord, every carved prow, every rune stone stood as a kind of defiance against forgetting. The Norsemen may have vanished, but their ghosts lingered in the language, the lore, and the blood of those who came after. The word Viking itself, once an occupation, became a myth. It stopped meaning raider and started meaning legend. The longships turned from weapons into symbols, carved on coins, painted on church walls, whispered about by poets. And yet, if you listen closely, you can still hear them. Not in the clash of swords or the roar of oars, but in the quiet rhythm of waves against the hull of an old fishing boat. In the northern lights that twist like serpents above the fjords. In the stubborn resilience of the people who still live in that cold, magnificent landscape. Because the truth is, the Viking Age never truly ended. It simply changed shape. The fire that once burned in open decks now flickers in stories. The courage that once drove ships across oceans now drives explorers into space. And the hunger for discovery, that refusal to stay still lives in us. Every time someone leaves the safety of the known to chase the horizon, the spirit of the Vikings sailed again. It's easy to romanticize them, the adventure, the bravery, the poetry of a cold sea and a crimson dawn. But beneath it all, they were simply human. Frightened, hopeful, curious. Trying, like all of us, to make sense of a world that was both beautiful and cruel. And maybe that's why they fascinate us still. Because the Viking story isn't just about conquest. It's about endurance, the will to keep moving forward, no matter how bitter the wind. So the next time you look out at a dark horizon and feel that old restlessness, that pull toward the unknown, remember them. The sailors who braved ice and storm, not for glory, but because standing still felt worse. Their ships may have rotted, their gods may have fallen silent, but the dream that drove them, the dream of finding warmth in a cold world, still sails on and somewhere. In the quiet hum of the sea, their voices still echo, whispering through the mist, reminding us that all ages end. But some never really die. The Viking Age may have drifted into the past, but its echoes still ripple through time, faint, steady, like the rhythm of an oar cutting through calm water. Walk through a modern Scandinavian city, and you'll feel it, not in horned helmets or blazing longships, but in something quieter, deeper. It's in the way people look out over the sea, as if expecting something to return. It's in the sharp simplicity of design, in the honesty of craftsmanship, in the quiet pride of endurance. Even in silence, the North remembers. In Norway's fjords, fishermen still set out before dawn, their boats smaller, their tools modern, but their spirit ancient. They face the same wind, the same cold, the same endless horizon that once tested their ancestors. The sea has not changed, and neither has humanity's need to meet it head-on. In Denmark, archaeologists still uncover the bones of old longships, their timbers blackened with age. Each plank tells a story, of voyages that began in frost and ended in legend. These weren't mere war machines, they were expressions of belief that man could carve his destiny against. Impossible odds. Even now, we look at them with awe, wondering how woodland holes once dared to touch the unknown. Sweden carries the memory differently, not through conquest, but through quiet endurance. In its forests, ancient rune stones still stand, half buried in moss, their carvings fade. But the words remain, messages of love, loss, bravery. They weren't written for us, yet somehow they speak directly to us, because the emotions haven't changed. Grief still feels the same. So does longing. So does the ache of goodbye. And far to the west, in Iceland, the edge of the known world, the sagas are still alive. Children learn them in school. Families recite them in winter. Not as fantasy, but as heritage. Every valley, every cliff, every lonely farm seems haunted by the voices of those first settlers. They built their homes in a land of fire and ice, a place that felt like both punishment and promise. And somehow, they thrived. But the Viking spirit didn't stay in the north. It spread across oceans. In place names, in words, in bloodlines. York, Dublin, Normandy, even the English language bears their fingerprints. The days of the week, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, are still tributes to their gods, 1,000 years gone. And Odin still rules midweek. Their descendants sail again, not with axes, but with ideas. The explorers of later centuries, the navigators, the whalers, the Arctic dreamers, all carried a spark of that old defiance. Even the astronauts of the 20th century, staring down from orbit at the fragile curve of the Earth, felt something ancient, that same wordless pull toward what lies beyond. Because at its core, the Viking story isn't about war. It's about exploration, the human need to see what's next. They just happened to live in a time when discovery meant danger, when curiosity had to fight its way through cold, hunger, and fear. But still, they went, always forward. Maybe that's the truest legacy they left us. Not their weapons, not their gods, but that strange, restless courage. That belief that the horizon is not the end, only an invitation. And perhaps, when we dream of ships gliding through fog, of lanterns flickering on dark waves, of voices calling across the sea, we're not just imagining the past. We're remembering it. Something deep in our bones recognizes the rhythm, that wind, that sound of a wood creaking against tide. It's the inheritance of motion, the memory of never staying still. Even now, we build our own longships, not of oak, but of steel and light. They cross skies instead of seas, and their crews stare not at the stars as myths, but as destinations. And in those moments, when silence falls between transmissions and all that exists is the hum of engines and the vast unknown, the old voices stir again. They whisper, softly, across 1,000 years, you've always been one of us, because we are, the urge to explore, to understand, to go. It never left humanity, it only changed form. We may no longer row across freezing seas, but we still chase the edge of possibility. We still build, dream, discover, and sometimes destroy. And every time we look back at history, trying to understand those who came before, we're not just studying them, we're searching for ourselves in their reflection. So when the night grows quiet, and the wind starts to sound like oars in the dark, remember, the Viking world isn't gone. It's sleeping beneath the waves, waiting to be remembered. And if you close your eyes long enough, you might just hear it. The creak of timber, the low call of a distant horn, the slow, rhythmic beat of a world that never truly died. Because history doesn't vanish, it drifts, and tonight it drifts softly across the North Sea. One last voyage toward dawn. The North Sea is not kind. It's a restless, grey expanse that seems to breathe misery and exhale frost. For the Vikings men who carved lives out of ice, salt, and storm, it wasn't just a sea. It was a test. A daily question from the gods. Do you still deserve to live? And if you've ever stood on a modern ferry deck in February, even for 5 minutes, you know what I mean. The cold doesn't just sting, it haunts. It gets into your bones, then into your thoughts. But imagine spending weeks on open water with no cabins, no engines, and believe it or not, no fire. Because here's the strange part. Viking ships were wooden, Todd, and full of wool and rope basically, a floating bonfire waiting for a spark. So, no open flames were allowed at sea, which leaves the question, how on earth did they stay warm? The short answer, they didn't. The longer answer, they endured. Vikings didn't chase comfort. They chased resilience. Everything about their world was built around surviving just long enough to see the next sunrise. Their solution wasn't heating, it was insulation, thick layers of wool, fur-lined cloaks, and what we'd probably call strategic suffering. And while the sagas never bother to mention the small stuff like how cold their toes got or how hard it was to sleep, they do mention how gods favored those who could endure without complaint. Endurance, not ease, was the Viking virtue. At sea, men huddled under shared cloaks. They ate dry fish, chewed on barley bread, drank cold ale that was sometimes more ice than liquid. Sleep came in small, shaking intervals, broken by the creak of timbers and the slap of freezing spray. And yet they sang. Drottkvot, their complex alliterative poetry, not just to pass time, but to keep spirits alive. A Viking's voice, low and rhythmic, was as much warmth as any fire. But when the storms came, and the nights turned blacker than ink, warmth took on a spiritual form. It became about faith, memory, and belonging. They'd call upon the old gods, Thor for thunder, Jord for the sea, and even Odin himself, who once hung frozen upon Yggdrasil in search of wisdom. It's not hard to imagine a crew, their breath fogging the air, whispering those ancient names into the wind, reminding the sea that they were still alive, as dawn broke over the icy waters. And the frost turned every rope to iron. They'd spot land, perhaps the Shetlands, or a rocky inlet off Norway, and only then, would fire return. They'd drag driftwood ashore, shield their trembling hands, and watch flame rise again. And that first crackle of fire after days at sea, it must have felt divine for Vikings. Fire wasn't just warmth, it was civilization, rebirth, and proof that even the coldest gods couldn't fully break them. And as that smoke curled into the grey northern sky, they knew one thing for a certain. The sea might freeze them, the wind might mock them, but they'd always find a way to light their world again. Fade to the slow sound of waves breaking against a hull. Then the faint crackle of fire on a distant shore. The ocean, to a Viking, was more than a place to sail. It was a living god, unpredictable, hungry, and always demanding something in return. Every voyage was a negotiation. You gave it sweat, strength, sometimes blood, and in exchange, it granted passage. And so, when they faced the cold, they didn't ask how to escape it. They asked how to outlast it. The Viking world wasn't designed for comfort. It was designed for endurance, a culture born of scarcity, where every hardship became a lesson, every chill a test of loyalty to life itself. The ships, long and narrow, cut through the sea like silver blades. There were no cabins, no walls, no warm corners. Every man slept beneath the open sky, wrapped in fur stiff with salt, their shields turned sideways to break the wind. When the snow fell, and it often did, even at sea, they simply turned their faces away and kept rowing. There's a kind of beauty in accepting nature's indifference, and yet daring to keep moving through it. The sagas never speak of weakness. They don't tell us who shivered, who cursed the wind, or who quietly cried into their frozen beards at night. But you can feel it there, between the lines, the unspoken truth that survival was not heroic. It was exhausting. At times, warmth came from motion. The oars, heavy and wet, demanded rhythm, stroke after stroke, muscle against ice. The more they rowed, the more heat they made. It was a cruel balance. Stop, and you'd freeze. Move, and you'd burn what little strength you had left. Meals were brief moments of mercy. Salted meat, smoked fish, sometimes a spoonful of porridge eaten cold from wooden bowls. They drank ale because water spoiled, and sometimes, when the sea froze their lips, they'd chew on ice just to feel something in their mouths. Still, there was laughter. The Vikings weren't just warriors, they were storytellers. Round the hearth, when they finally reached shore, they'd recount tales of frost giants and trickster gods, of voyages where the waves themselves rose up to test them. And though they'd exaggerate, as all men do, one thing was always true. They'd faced the cold and returned. Their ships were not only instruments of war or exploration. They were moving sanctuaries, small, fragile worlds floating between the known and the unknown. A Viking ship was home, weapon, and coffin all in one. And when they crossed from the icy fjords to the open ocean, they weren't just chasing plunder or land. They were chasing survival, proof that they could go where no one else did. Because to live in that world, in those seas, was to understand a truth we've mostly forgotten today, that comfort dulls the spirit. The Vikings lived sharper, harder, closer to the edge, and they believed that only through enduring could one truly deserve to live. So when we look at their ships today, the curved prows carved like dragons, the sails stitched from wool thick as armor, we're not just seeing engineering, we're seeing faith. Faith in human endurance, faith that even when warmth was gone, the will to keep moving was enough, and for them, that was all that mattered. The sound of a creaking mast fades, replaced by the steady rhythm of rowing, slow, deliberate, defiant against the wind. When you imagine the North Sea, you might think of vast grey waves and endless fog. But for the Vikings, it was a map, a living, shifting path carved by instinct, stars and memory. They didn't have compasses. They didn't have charts as we know them. What they had was something older, an intimacy with the sea itself. They knew its moods, its smells, the way it sounded before a storm. The groan of waves told them how deep they were. The flight of birds told them how close they were to land. The taste of the air, salt or brine or iron, spoke like a whisper from the gods. And yet, all of that was layered with cold, every sense dulled by frost. Every decision tested by fatigue. Imagine steering a ship through night fog, while ice forms on your beard and your hands ache too much to grip the tiller. That was the Viking world. One misjudged gust, and the sea claimed you. Still, they pressed on. The secret was rhythm, the rhythm of nature, of rowing, of trust. The helmsman, usually the most experienced aboard, didn't steer so much as listen. His job was to feel the ocean beneath the hull, its pull, its weight, its heartbeat, and keep the ship in tune with it. They also carried a strange tool, the sunstone. Not a myth, but a crystal, Iceland spar, that could polarize light even through clouds. By rotating it, they could find the direction of the sun, hidden beyond fog and storm. It was ancient science, dressed in myth, and for centuries it worked. Now, think about that, a handful of men, wrapped in wool and courage, crossing open seas with nothing but crystal, instinct, and faith. They didn't call it navigation, they called it survival. When the temperature dropped so low that the sails stiffened and the ropes crackled with frost, they'd lower everything and drift, waiting for dawn, the sea, when calm, frozen patches, turning their world into a floating mosaic of white and grey. The men huddled close, conserving body heat, sharing silence. But silence, in a Viking ship, was never empty. It was reverent. It was listening to the world, to the gods, to the whispers of home. And sometimes, far out in that desolate cold, they'd hear something else. The creak of the hull echoing like voices, the groan of ice sounding like laughter. They called it Havrit, the breaking of the sea, for them. It was the ocean speaking. They didn't fear it. They respected it. Fear was a luxury they couldn't afford. Instead, they adapted, learned, and endured, because in their worldview, every hardship was a message, every storm a teacher. So when people today speak of Viking toughness, they often think of axes, armor, and raids. But real toughness, it was here, in the quiet, endless cold, in the patience to endure it without fire, and in the courage to keep moving forward when the world froze round you. And that is the essence of Viking survival, not brute strength, but calm defiance. A kind of faith so deep it doesn't need to shout. It just keeps going. Sound fades to wind passing through rigging, followed by the distant cry of gulls. By now, you can probably picture it, a Viking ship drifting through grey seas, its crew half frozen, but somehow, impossibly, still singing. Their breath turns to mist, their beards stiff with frost, yet their voices rise above the wind, rough, cracked, but steady, because in their world, warmth didn't come from fire. It came from defiance. Fire was fleeting. Defiance lasted. Every spark they made with flint and tinder had to be earned, shielded from wind, coaxed to life, guarded like a god. They burned driftwood, whale fat, even dried seaweed. But more often than not, there was nothing to burn. And so they turned inward, burning willpower instead of wood. It sounds poetic, but it was brutally real. Sleep meant freezing. Movement meant pain. The line between living and dying blurred somewhere between the second and third hour of rowing. And yet, they laughed. Not because they were happy. Because laughter, to them, was another form of resistance. A Viking laughing in the face of cold wasn't mocking nature. He was mocking death. Every shiver was a reminder that he was still alive. Every frostbitten finger was a medal of endurance. And if you died at sea, well, that was the best place to do it. The sagas promised Valhalla, but only to those who faced the storm without fear. And perhaps that's the strangest part. For the Vikings, suffering wasn't punishment, it was purpose. The cold wasn't an enemy. It was a companion, harsh but honest. It never lied to you. It simply demanded to know, how much can you endure? Most men prayed for safety. The Vikings prayed for the strength to laugh through danger. So when they came home, when the longships finally slid into quiet fjords under pale dawn, they didn't boast about the gold they took or the lands they saw. They spoke of the cold, how it bit, how it burned, how it tried to kill them but failed. That was pride. That was identity. That was warmth, the kind no fire could give. And maybe that's the secret the modern world has forgotten. Comfort can make you content, but it can't make you strong. The Vikings didn't chase seas. They chased endurance, not because they enjoyed pain, but because they understood what it proved, that life, in all its misery and beauty, is something you must fight for. They conquered the cold not by avoiding it, but by outlasting it. They made the ice a part of themselves. Their warmth wasn't around them, it was within them. And that's the paradox of Viking survival. When you stop needing warmth to live, you become something even fire can't touch. Fade out with the sound of creaking timbers, the soft hum of a ship rocking against ice, and one last echo of a Viking chant carried on the wind. The Reformation wasn't only a political revolution, it was a mass unmasking of clerical sin wrapped in the velvet of divine outrage. Across England and Europe, whispers about priests, monks, and nuns were no longer safely buried behind altar screens. Henry VIII split from Rome had cracked the dam. Every sin, every secret, every quiet act of hypocrisy now flooded out like dirty water from a centuries-old pipe. Inspectors groped in royal authority, combed through monasteries and convents with a zeal that bordered on voyeurism. They found ledgers of indulgences, but also midwives' notes, hidden bottles of wine, caches of gold, letters scented with longing. In one abbey, they uncovered the remains of infants buried beneath the flagstones, silent proof that even the holiest walls could not contain the oldest human urges. The reports written afterward were part record, part scandal sheet. Here, one reads, were found 3 nuns in the company of 2 friars, locked in mutual confession. The tone was moral, but the curiosity was unmistakable. Every page dripped with outrage and fascination. The Reformation needed villains, and the Church was kind enough to provide them. But beneath the political theatre, there was something sadder, almost tragic, for centuries. These men and women had been forced to choose between faith and flesh, and in losing both, they found themselves unmoored. When the monasteries were dissolved, monks who'd spent a lifetime in prayer wandered the countryside as beggars. Nuns, stripped of their cloisters, returned to families that no longer wanted them. The divine order had collapsed, leaving silence where once there had been song, and yet, in that silence, something new began to stir, a different kind of faith. Not the faith of priests and popes, but of merchants, sailors and thinkers. The age of trade was dawning. God's house was no longer made of stone, but of sails and maps. When the Vikings had roamed the seas, they believed the edge of the world was lined with monsters. Now, centuries later, those same waters had become highways of ambition. The cold endurance that once defined the Norse spirit was reborn in another form: exploration. England's hunger for trade grew as fast as its appetite for power. From the icy North Sea to the sunlit harbours of Lisbon, the world was unfolding like a vast, living scroll. Every ship that left port carried not just goods, but ideas, maps, manuscripts, and whispers of lands beyond imagining. A sailor might have prayed less than a monk, but he saw more of God's creation than most priests ever would. The compass replaced the crucifix as a symbol of destiny. And yet, the sea was still a kind of church, unpredictable, merciless, humbling. The wind sang hymns across the rigging, and storms delivered sermons that few forgot. Mariners became the new mystics, translating the world not in Latin, but in latitude. What had once been the Vikings' frozen nightmare was now the merchant stream. Trade routes stitched continents together: silk from China, spice from India, gold from Africa. And with every voyage, the map of the world became more precise, and the boundaries of faith. A little less certain, long before English ships dared the southern seas, another traveller had already walked the veins of the world. Ibn Battuta, scholar, pilgrim, wanderer, he began his journey in 1325. Intending to visit Mecca, he returned nearly 30 years later. Having seen more of earth than any man alive, he crossed deserts where bones turned to dust before prayers could reach the sky. He sailed seas where pirates prayed before killing, just to stay on God's good side. From the mosques of Delhi to the markets of Mali, he chronicled a world that was vast yet intimately connected, bound by trade, faith, and curiosity. Battuta's world was not a map, but a network, living arteries of culture, silk, sugar, and stories flowed through them alike. And though he lived in an age before telescopes or compasses, he understood something profound, that travel was a kind of worship, to move, to see, to endure. These were acts of devotion. While monks debated the purity of the soul, and kings fought over who had God's favor, Ibn Battuta simply kept walking. His faith wasn't in institutions, it was in motion. By the time English explorers reached the Arctic, they were retracing the ghostly roots of the Norsemen, men who had once rode these waters by instinct and myth alone. Now, centuries later, the descendants of their world carried compasses instead of courage. And yet the cold treated them no differently. One sailor's log from the 16th century records, "The sea about us doth hiss and crack as if the earth were tearing. His ink froze between sentences, the food turned to stone, yet they pressed on. Driven by the same stubborn fire that once burned in Viking hearts, there's something deeply human about chasing warmth through cold. The Vikings had found it in defiance, the explorers sought it in discovery. But both were searching for the same thing, meaning, a reason to suffer, a way to prove that endurance was its own reward. And perhaps that is the quiet truth of every frozen voyage, that warmth is not the absence of cold, but the refusal to yield to it. History has a strange sense of humor. The Vikings braved ice for glory, the priests preached purity for power, the merchants sailed for profit, and yet all of them were chasing the same invisible flame. Not of fire, but of purpose. In the end, warmth was never about comfort. It was about meaning, the heat that comes from belief, from motion, from creation. The Vikings carried it in their hearts across frozen seas. The monks lost it in stone cloisters. The explorers rekindled it on the decks of creaking ships. Even now, we still chase that same ember, through cities of glass, through glowing screens, through the endless night of modern ambition. The seas are calmer, but the cold remains. It's just inside us now, waiting to be met with courage. So, how did the Vikings survive the icy seas without fire? They didn't. They became the fire. Mecca was more than a city. It was an idea that breathed for centuries. It had drawn wanderers from the corners of the known world like iron to a compass, and Ibn Battuta, weary from deserts and trials, stepped into it as though entering a dream. The air itself seemed to shimmer with sanctity. Every breeze carried the scent of incense and dust. Merchants shouted in a dozen languages: Arabic, Persian, Berber, Swahili, Turkic, their words weaving a living tapestry of faith and trade. Here, beneath the endless sky, the sacred met the worldly. Caravans that had crossed burning dunes for weeks now poured into the city's narrow lanes. Camels knelt beneath loads of silk and cinnamon. Water sellers clinked copper cups together. Scholars debated law beneath the shade of palm trees, their discussions drifting over the murmur of pilgrims reciting prayers. And when night fell, the city transformed again. Oil lamps flickered along the arcades, and poets began their recitations. spinning verses that mingled learning and devotion until dawn. For Ibn Battuta, this was more than pilgrimage. It was revelation. In Mecca, he discovered what travel truly meant. It was not merely distance. It was meaning carried in motion. Each person here had a story. A merchant from Mali bringing gold dust. A scholar from Damascus seeking hadith. A sailor from Yemen telling tales of China's floating cities. He realized that Mecca was the center of the world not because of its geography, but because of its gravity. It pulled stories, souls, and civilizations into one orbit. He began recording everything: the rituals, the dialects, the clothing, the subtle ways Islam shaped lives from one coast to another. He wrote of how devotion sounded different in every tongue, yet always returned to the same rhythm of peace. To him, every encounter was a verse in an unfolding revelation. Even the humblest pilgrim, barefoot and dust-streaked, carried wisdom from lands he had never seen. Months passed. Pilgrims performed their rites, prayed, and began their long journeys home. But Ibn Battuta lingered. His heart refused to rest. The holy city had awakened something, a hunger not of the body but of the soul. The Kaaba had shown him direction, yes, but not an end. So, when the caravan formed for departure, one heading west toward Egypt, another east toward Yemen, and one vast train of travelers bound north toward Iraq and Persia, Ibn Battuta joined them. The desert stretched before him again, the horizon wide and merciless, as he left Mecca behind. He looked back one last time at the city-esque glow fading beneath the sun and whispered a prayer of gratitude. Mecca had been his sanctuary, but now the world was calling, and the pilgrim was ready to become the scholar of nations. The road north awaited, the road to Babylon's ruins, Baghdad's wisdom, and Persia's poetry, and somewhere beyond those dusty horizons, destiny was already watching him approach. The caravan rolled northward, cutting across the sands where empires had risen and fallen like the tides. Ibn Battuta, astride a camel whose gait swayed like a ship at sea, followed the same routes once taken by prophets, conquerors, and poets. Every dune whispered history, and he listened. They passed through the vast plains of Mesopotamia, the land between two rivers, where the Tigris and Euphrates had once fed the cradle of civilization. Here, beneath the scorching sun, Babylon lay buried, its ziggurats now nothing but scattered brick and memory. Battuta would gaze across the horizon and imagine the voices of priests and scribes that once filled these same winds. It was humbling. Even the greatest cities could be reduced to dust. When they finally reached Baghdad, it was not the Baghdad of legend. The golden capital of Harun al-Rashid and the Abbasid caliphs had long been sacked by the Mongols, yet even in ruin, the city still glimmered. Its libraries and mosques had survived in fragments, and its soul remained intact. The scent of parchment and ink still filled its madrasas, and scholars from across the Islamic world came to debate, translate, and preserve what knowledge had not yet burned. For Ibn Battuta, Baghdad was revelation wrapped in decay. He spent his days moving through markets where old men sold manuscripts rescued from forgotten shelves, and his nights listening to theologians and philosophers argue under flickering lanterns. The Mongols had shattered Baghdad's walls, but not its mind. The people rebuilt not with stone, but with words. It was here that Battuta's intellect began to bloom. His sharp understanding of Islamic law and his gift for conversation drew attention. Judges and scholars sought his opinion. Governors sent him invitations. The son of Tangier, once just another traveler in the desert, now walked among the intellectual, elite of the Middle East, and yet, amidst the splendor of its learning, Baghdad carried the scent of ghosts. Along the riverbanks, he could still see broken statues, crumbled bridges, and the empty eyes of minarets that no longer call the faithful to prayer. The Tigris shimmered in the sunset, reflecting the ruins like a mirror of time, showing what once was and what might be again. Standing there, Ibn Battuta realized something profound. The world's glory was fleeting, but its wisdom endured. The Mongols had taken the empire, but not the idea. Civilization, he thought, was like water. You could spill it, scatter it, but it would always find a way to flow again. And so, he pressed onward, toward Persia, toward the heart of the Islamic Golden Age, where poets spoke the language of stars, and every dome seemed to touch the heavens. The scholar within him had awakened fully now, but another transformation awaited, for beyond Persia lay India, a land of palaces, dangers, and destiny. By the time Ibn Battuta reached Persia, the dust of countless roads had already colored his robes. Yet here, beneath the domes and minarets of ancient cities, he found a different kind of beauty, one woven not from gold or conquest, but from words and wisdom. Persia was unlike anywhere else he had seen. It shimmered with poetry. Even the air seemed to hum with rhythm. Tabriz was his first marvel, once the jewel of the Ilkhanate. It still glowed with Mongol grandeur tempered by Persian artistry. Its markets overflowed with color, bolts of Chinese silk, trays of Damascus steel, baskets of Indian spices, and Persian carpets so intricate they looked painted by dreams. The Silk Road was alive here, pulsing with life like an artery of civilization. Every merchant, every traveler, every scholar carried a fragment of another world. Battuta walked through it all in awe. He met philosophers who could quote Aristotle and astronomers who mapped the heavens by candlelight. But it was the poets who captured his heart. In Shiraz, he listened to men recite verses of Saudi and Hafiz, lines that danced between love and faith, sorrow and transcendence. To them, poetry was not art. It was devotion in disguise, and Battuta, ever the student of the soul, wrote their words into his heart. He saw Persia as a living classroom, every city a teacher, every person a lesson. In Isfahan, he studied law with jurists whose arguments flowed like rivers. In Krazan, he walked streets once trampled by Mongol horses, but now filled with children playing, laughter echoing between rebuilt walls. Civilization, he realized, was rebirth itself. From ruin came renewal, from dust came poetry. He recorded everything, how Persians greeted one another, the architecture of their mosques, the fragrance of their food, saffron, rosewater, pomegranate. His notes would one day form the most vivid map of the medieval world ever written. Yet even as he studied, a restlessness stirred within him. The more he saw, the more he wanted to see. Danger was never far. Bandits haunted the mountain passes, and once his caravan was ambushed. Stripped of his possessions and nearly killed, Ibn Battuta sat alone beneath the stars, his world reduced to silence. And still, he gave thanks. Every loss, he wrote later, was a mercy in disguise, a reminder that faith is lighter when unburdened by gold. When he finally crossed into the lands of Afghanistan and beyond, he was no longer the pilgrim who had left Tangier years before. He was something greater, a bridge between worlds. He had spoken with kings and beggars, prayed in deserts and palaces, and found in every face a reflection of the same divine spark. The road now led eastward, through India, where empires gleamed and rulers played with fate like fire. But Persia lingered in his memory like a fragrance that would never fade. It was, he would later write, a land where beauty and intellect share the same tongue. And so, as he crossed the mountain passes toward Hindustan, Ibn Battuta carried not only his journal and faith, but the poetry of a civilization that refused to die. By the time Ibn Battuta descended from the Afghan mountains and entered the plains of India, his legend had already begun to precede him. Word of a learned Moroccan scholar, judge, and traveller had spread through the trade routes like wildfire. And when he finally arrived at the gates of Delhi, he found a city unlike any other he had ever seen, vast, vibrant, and humming with contradiction. Delhi in the 14th century was a wonder wrapped in danger. The streets were a chaos of color and sound, elephants draped in silk, traders shouting prices over the roar of the crowds, and the scent of jasmine, spice, and sweat heavy in the air. At its heart stood the palace of Sultan Muhammad bin Talak, a man whispered about in equal parts, and terror. He was brilliant, unpredictable, and feared by all who served him. Scholars called him a genius, survivors called him mad. Battuta entered his court with both humility and confidence. The Sultan, ever drawn to intellect, recognized something in the Moroccan traveller, a mind that could match his own, and perhaps even temper it. He appointed Ibn Battuta as a Qadi, a royal judge, showering him with gold, servants, and fine clothes. Overnight, the man who had once slept beneath the stars became one of the most powerful foreigners in the Delhi Sultanate. But the palace was a gilded cage. Behind its marble walls, whispers carried more swiftly than prayers. Favors could vanish overnight, friendship could curdle into accusation. The Sultan's moods changed like the monsoon. Generosity one day, executions the next. Battuta watched as streets that one evening overflowed with feasts were, by morning, stained red with blood. He gives life and death with the same hand. Battuta later wrote, still, he endured, cautious, observant, always balancing faith with survival. His knowledge of law and diplomacy made him invaluable. The Sultan trusted him with disputes that could start wars, with messages to distant courts, with decisions that shaped the lives of thousands. Yet, even as he dined among nobles, a part of him longed for the open road again. Delhi, with all its grandeur, pressed too tightly on his spirit. Then came the opportunity, a mission that would change everything. The Sultan appointed him ambassador to China, tasked with leading a caravan across the Indian Ocean to the court of the great Yuan emperors. To others, it was an impossible task. To Ibn Battuta, it was freedom disguised as duty. He accepted at once. In 1342, the scholar-turned-statesman departed Delhi, leading an entourage of servants, sailors, and scholars. The journey began with celebration, music, drums, banners waving in the heat. But fate, as always, had other plans. As they reached the coast at Calicut, the sea seemed calm, until it wasn't. The monsoon descended like divine judgment. Waves rose higher than minarets. Ships snapped like twigs. Thunder rolled across the heavens. One vessel carrying royal gifts sank with all hands. Another was seized by pirates. Battuta himself was thrown into the sea and washed ashore half dead, stripped of everything but his will. He had left Delhi as an ambassador. He crawled onto the beach a beggar once more. Yet somehow, even disaster seemed to guide him toward destiny. Stranded but alive, he wandered the Indian Ocean world, to the Maldives where he became a royal judge and married into the ruling family, to Sri Lanka where he climbed the sacred mountain said to bear Adam's footprint, to the ports of Southeast Asia where every harbor was a universe of faiths, languages, and colors. Through it all, he remained what he had always been, a seeker. His fortune rose and fell like the tide, but his curiosity never dimmed. By the time he reached China years later, he had out-traveled nearly every man in history. And when he finally turned homeward, gray-haired and weathered by decades of wandering, He carried the world within him, its stories, its fates, its contradictions. In Tangier, he dictated it all to the scholar Ibn Juzi, creating the Rilla, the journey, a masterpiece that mapped not borders, but the bonds between people. He had set out as a pilgrim. He returned as history's greatest traveller, and somewhere between Mecca and China, between storm and silence, Ibn Battuta had discovered not just the world, but himself.